This is Ethics Lecture 4, Becoming Virtuous, our final lecture on Aristotle. As you'll recall from last lecture, we ended up making the distinction between moral and intellectual virtue. This is such an important distinction for Aristotle that I'm going to start again by kind of repeating some of the points that we mentioned last class. And this will be a theme that will run throughout much of ethics, and it's also a theme that runs throughout much of contemporary society when it comes to thinking about making judgments about people's moral character or their behaviors. On the one hand, excuse me, on the one hand, we grant that knowledge of right and wrong, the capacity to differentiate right from wrong, is absolutely critical to being able to make any judgment about someone's moral character. In other words, if someone lacks the capacity to differentiate right from wrong, if they're insane, for example, or if they're a very young child, then we don't treat them by the same moral standards. So what they're lacking then, in Aristotle's term, is they lack intellectual virtue. So it's absolutely critical for Aristotle that we possess knowledge. So some type of knowledge or rational activity is inseparable from being moral. And this is a trend or almost a common sense belief that one will find in much of moral philosophy. One exception that we'll see in this course is Hume. Hume will be different in that regard, but for the most part, knowledge is inseparable from being able to be moral. One of the reasons why young children aren't moral, why animals aren't moral, etc. It's this capacity for intellectual virtue. But then, as we discussed last lecture, intellectual virtue by itself is not alone. It is not enough. We also need to have the habits of doing what is right. And for Aristotle, there are two things about human nature that are absolutely sort of fundamental, and we really can't work against them, but must work with them. The first is that we are imitative creatures. We learn through imitation, and we imitate those that are around us, especially those who are our elders or people we admire. Primarily, this would be our parents, but also good friends, older siblings, etc. These are the people that kind of lay down the sort of model or the example that we, without even thinking about it, follow, imitate. The second is the fact that we do settle into habits. And once we settle into habits, we also, again, don't think about it. We just do it automatically. And so there's a kind of theme here that Aristotle's pointing to, and that is that in a lot of our daily actions, as we engage in the world and think about things and make judgments about people and so on, we do so largely without thinking. A lot of it is done out of habit. And so those habits that we acquire early on in life are absolutely pivotal or important. And it's going to be critical as well that these habits be in line with intellectual virtue. And so that's why for Aristotle we need both. We need both intellectual virtue and moral virtue. We need our moral virtue to be in line with what intellectual virtue would tell us is right. And we need intellectual virtue to be in line with our habits. So let's stick then, or focus on moral virtue, because I think intellectual virtue is one of those things that I think for Aristotle is important. And actually, I'm sorry, let's stick with intellectual virtue first. I want to focus on that one and things that are involved with it. Okay, first off, intellectual virtue with respect to the role it plays in being moral. In much of the reading of Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle focuses on contemplation or self-reflection. And the idea here for Aristotle is that by exercising our reason, not only with respect to our own lives, but also with respect to the lives of others, we can learn about what is right, what is wrong. This is, for Aristotle, one of the great virtues of literature. Aristotle in his Poetics will talk about how we can learn morally as much from a tragic play as from, or more actually, we could learn from a tragic play about ethics and morality than from a history. So take, for example, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, we could learn more about human pride and arrogance and corruption and all these various other issues, and learn about mistakes that people can make and so on and so forth, and learn about them in a way that becomes applicable to our own lives, something that we can really kind of take home as a lesson that is learned. We could do that better with literature because literature oftentimes is presented in a certain kind of universalistic style, meaning it's something that's applicable beyond the particular story being told. Whereas in a history, one can see it as that particular individual's life history, and that particular individual's life, that particular individual's choices are unrelated to my life. And so one may have less likelihood of getting the same moral lessons from a history text. So that's an example then for Aristotle, that even in literature and other ways of reading about the lives of others, we can learn about what is right, what works, what courses of conduct, etc., one should take in one's life. So intellectual virtue, although it is certainly a kind of natural faculty that we have, ability to exercise reason, and it's something that develops naturally over time as we grow up, it's also something that we can improve, and it's something that we can expand upon through contemplation, self-reflection, and learning from others. The other, and this is the more difficult one, at least with respect to changing, is moral virtue. Now, the way to understand moral virtue is to understand it in the context of what I like to call first and second nature. First nature, according to Aristotle, is our natural tendency to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Now, as you can imagine, our natural tendency to pursue pleasure and avoid pain is going to both lead us away from virtue and towards vice. So, for example, by pursuing pleasure, we're going to more likely than not be led into excess, gluttony, lack of temperance, and so on. Because if it feels right, we're going to take it to be right. So by pursuing pleasure, then we end up doing more than we probably should. At the same time, by avoiding pain, we often will not do things that we probably should do. We might not do something courageous, for example. We might not tell the truth in a circumstance where we should tell the truth. So the point here, and again, it's not really a controversial point, but we can kind of see Aristotle's reasons for it now, is that we aren't born automatically virtuous. It's something that we need to acquire. It's something that we need to learn. And that's where we get to the second nature. The second nature is precisely what we acquire. If we think about things that we take to be second nature, it's not something we're born with. If I can drive a stick shift car as if it's second nature, on the one hand, it means it's a habit. It's not something I think about when I do it, but it's also not something that I was born doing. I had to learn to do it. And if anyone's learned to drive a stick shift car, you know it's not necessarily an easy thing to learn to do it. Swimming. Some people can swim second nature. They don't even really think about it. Or riding a bike can be second nature to people. But as we all know, it takes a lot of trial and error and a lot of difficult times actually learning or acquiring that ability. So the second nature, or the moral virtue that we ought to acquire, is one of pursuing virtue and avoiding vice. So how do we get from a first nature of pursuing pleasure, avoiding pain, which is likely going to lead us into vice or away from virtue, to second nature where we pursue virtue and avoid vice? How do we get there? Well, the one-word answer for that for Aristotle is education. Now, education is taken by Aristotle in the broad sense of that term. It's not just book learning where you sit in a class and listen to a teacher, or even a type of education that one might have had in Aristotle's day where you hang out with your master and follow them around all day and so on. Now, that would be a source of education, but for most people, as Aristotle was quick to point out, most people by the time they are 10, if not even younger, will have already gotten most of the moral education that they will ever get. By which I mean they will have got most of the moral education that will have pretty firmly entrenched their moral character and their moral viewpoint on the world. I mean, much of those habits are established well before they start hanging around with masters and philosophers and do that type of thing. At that stage in point, one is usually pursuing intellectual virtue rather than moral virtue. So education then is taken really to be the influence of one's elders upon one, or parents, uh, older siblings, friends, etc. In other words, it's all the life experiences that have molded one's expectations and character traits. That is the education. That is how we acquire the second nature that we all acquire. So we all have a basic second nature or a moral character. Now, some of our moral characters may have some bad habits involved with it. And there's no doubt that that's true. We all have our pet vices, so to speak. And this then leads to a big issue or question that Aristotle spends a fair amount of time on. How do we go about correcting our bad habits? And this is where one can take the Nicomachean Ethics as kind of one of the first self-help books in Western civilization. Because Aristotle recognizes that we all desire to be happy, as we discussed in the last lecture. And by happiness, he means live life well. But now he's coming to the point where he recognizes that bad habits can stand in the way of this happiness, of making the right decisions. And so now the question is, how can we go about improving these bad habits? This leads to what I call Aristotle's three-step program. And I intentionally call it the three-step program because it is comparable to the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step program. Though with 3 steps, it's much easier to memorize. And the first step, I think, for both of them is the same. I think in the 12-step program is you have to admit that you have a problem. And for obvious reason, that if one doesn't think one has a drinking problem or an addiction problem, then they wouldn't even begin to go about making the changes or doing the work to fix it. Similarly, for Aristotle, the first step is to recognize your vices as a vice. And this is extremely difficult, to recognize your vice as a vice, because if it's a habit, you may not even recognize that you're doing it. And if it brings you pleasure, it might seem like it's the right thing to do as well. And if it feels good, well, how could it be wrong? And if it's something you're used to doing, to do anything differently wouldn't feel right. And so these are some of the reasons why it's just so hard to even notice that one has a vice as a vice. So there are 2 ways for Aristotle suggests that one can begin to recognize your vices as vices. One is to ask yourself, what do you do for the sake of pleasure? Since pleasure is that natural first nature that we have, and since the pursuit of pleasure tends to lead towards vice and away from virtue, things that we do for the sake of pleasure that make us feel good may very well be one of our vices. It may not be, but again, as Aristotle was pointing out, as a kind of active contemplation or self-reflection, one might ask oneself, okay, what am I doing for the sake of pleasure? Am I going out to eat too much? Am I buying too much online? Am I drinking too much, etc., etc., those types of questions. And then one might say, no, actually, I've got plenty of money to spare. I'm well within my means. No, I'm just having a beer every couple days with friends. No, that's no problem. But then one may go and may recognize, well, I probably am going a little excessive. So one may, through this route, come to recognize that a particular behavior or choices or decisions that they are making are not the right choices. Getting back to the notion of virtue here. They aren't the right choices, but either in excess or deficiency in some way or form. So that's the first way, to notice what you do for the sake of pleasure. The second is to have good friends. And good friends is meant here in both senses of the term good. Good as in a close friend, someone that knows you real well and that you know and trust. So this type of a good friend would be someone who, if they were to point out one of your vices as a vice, you would trust that they know you well enough to recognize that this is something that you do. And also, you would take that they have your best interest at heart. Whereas a stranger, someone comes up to you don't know very well and points out a vice of yours, even if they are right, you wouldn't probably take them very seriously, because you could easily chalk it up that they don't know you very well, and they should mind their own business, and you might not even trust them, might not think they have your best interest at heart. So a good friend is someone who you trust and knows you well, would point that out. And there it's important because, again, going back to the notion that these habits can be so well ingrained, we're not even aware that we are doing such things. And so we aren't always a good mirror to ourselves. And having a friend point out vices that we might fall into, they can act as a mirror to ourselves that we can't. So that's the one sense in which a good friend is going to help. So good as in a close friend. And the other moral sense of good is good as in moral. So a good friend who is also interested in becoming as virtuous as they can be too. Because if you hang out with some friends, and they can very well encourage excessive behavior too. So it's not always the case that good friends will encourage and bring us to do what is best. So that's one way in which we can come to recognize our vices as vices. So let's say we've done this. We've gone through this first step, and we've recognized a particular vice as a vice, and we've decided we want to change it. That leads us to the second step. The second step is to overcompensate. And by overcompensate, I simply mean that one goes in the opposite direction of one's natural habit here. So if one tends to be shy, then one will move towards the direction of what will feel to them like being overly social. And that's going to feel awkward or uncomfortable, especially if the vice is a kind of habit. Doing the opposite is going to feel weird, strange. It's not going to feel right. But it may very well be hitting the bullseye. It's kind of like, and Aristotle gives this metaphor, if one keeps missing a target a little bit to the left, 3 inches to the left, let's say, but you want to hit the bullseye, well, you can aim 3 inches to the right. Well, it might seem like you're being excessive because you're moving 3 inches to the right of the target when you want to hit the target. You may, in fact, hit the target bullseye. And so that's where overcompensating can definitely come in to help. And also having a good friend who's there to support you and witnessing and saying, yeah, you did great, you did a good job. So that's another area where they can come in and help you with your overcompensating for the vice. And then the third and final step, once you do that, is to practice, to do it again and again and again. One doesn't wake up one day and decide, I'm going to become a flute player. One has to, through practice, acquire the functions, the abilities, the habits and traits that makes one a flute player. Similarly, one has to, over practicing this overcompensation again and again, get to the point where one does it automatically, where it becomes one's new second nature. And so it's in this context, then, that one will become happy. And the final and main thing that I want to stress as I kind of wrap things up here for Aristotle is to recognize that for Aristotle, we are indeed a social animal. And so for Aristotle, then, happiness is not simply something that we do by ourselves. I hope it's been clear by now the extent to which friends, good friends, for example, are important. But more importantly, it's in the context of our lives with others where we find our happiness. And as Aristotle says in the reading, there's a limit to be drawn to this. I mean, the friends of friends of friends, their misery may not affect us, but our own happiness is intimately connected with those we are with. We are going to be drawn towards social interaction. We are a political animal, as Aristotle says. And so learning how to live with others and learn from others is absolutely critical to our own happiness. And it's no coincidence that the book that Aristotle worked on right after the Nicomachean Ethics was his Politics, because it's in a political context as well, where one's happiness is to be found. In other words, if one lives in a bad state, a poorly governed state, with unpredictable consequences and tyranny and oppression and so on, then similarly one's happiness is going to be hard won if able to be won at all. And so if one is truly concerned with one's own happiness, one is also going to become concerned with the well-being of one's society and state. And this becomes the important concept of civic virtue for Aristotle. It's to really realize one's full potential in one's own happiness, one has to also realize one's full potential within the social and political context. And so that will entail some sort of civic virtue, acting for the better of the whole, acting for the state, acting for society. And so the political and social context becomes very much an important part of one's happiness. Well, I think this lecture and the previous lecture gives a pretty good overview of Aristotle's ethics. Between that and the readings, you should be in good shape.